for a few minutes about the role of forgiveness in the Talmud and in Jewish life. And when the rabbi is finished, then I'll do the introduction for Susan Shapiro, and we will get started. Rabbi, it's all yours.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Susan, for the beautiful book, and thank you to everybody who participated. Actually, I don't always get to read the whole book, but this time I got to read the whole book. Right. And so Susan could teach this as well as I can, because clearly there's a lot of information there on the Jewish take of things as well. So, trying to say, Rabbi, can you talk about forgiveness in 3 minutes and everything Judaism has to say about it is, kind of like not always the easiest task. So we'll play a Hillel thing and stand on one foot and give you a couple of general comments. And then I want to make a specific comment that may tee into Susan after her introduction and the presentation. So the general comments are much of what people know from the high holidays, right? There are various steps to seeking forgiveness in Judaism. They involve speaking aloud. They involve acknowledgement. They involve asking for forgiveness. Many people know the rule: if you traditionally ask 3 times, and once if they say no, then you're off the hook. But you have to actually make an effort, and you can't sort of throw up your hands and say, if I harmed somebody else, I can't, come before God and say, well, it's their fault, God. You have to do the work, right? And we talk about that between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Maimonides talks about what happens if you find yourself in the same situation, right, more than one time, and only if you're actually in that space can you truly try to quote unquote repent and do it and have a do-over. That's called like complete forgiveness, as it were. But I purposely wasn't using the word that I'm going to now use, which is what's the word for forgiveness and repentance? Well, forgiveness is slicha, but repentance is tshuva. And tshuva, we all say repentance, but really it means turning. And that actually, I think, is a key thing that I want to say as a lead into the talk tonight, which is seeking forgiveness is all about turning. Turning to who? Well, that's a good question, right? Turning to the other person, right? Turning inward to ourselves, turning to God, to whatever extent God, plays a role in our lives, right? Or whatever we feel that means, right? So there's a lot of turning that goes on in this business of forgiveness and shifting our posture and shifting our position. And actually, as I was reading the book, I was thinking about this, right? Because there's all sorts of turning that goes on, turning it over and over and over and over, and turning and returning, and that's a very sort of Jewish thing in terms of that piece of the process. But the other thing I'll say, which is one last thing before we get to the speaker, there's a whole notion on the high holidays, which is the classic forgiveness time, right? The truth is, by the way, we ask for forgiveness 3 times a day in Judaism at every service. But the holidays are the reset, I always say, right? And so what happens on the holidays? We really think about forgiveness in terms of judgment and in terms of compassion. And liturgically, actually, when we talk about God, we're trying to move God from the seat of judgment to the seat of compassion. If that's a helpful metaphor or not, depends on who you are, right? But this whole idea of moving from judgment to compassion, I think, also plays a role here, right? So it's not just about saying things out loud, and it's not just about asking for forgiveness, and it's not just about turning towards ourselves and other people and our God. It's really about trying to see if we can shift our seat from a seat of judgment to a seat of compassion. Doesn't mean we're not have opinions or thoughts or even judgments, but can we learn to shift our focus? And I think that is another piece of Jewish views on forgiveness. So that's the Cliff Notes. Really was a wonderful book to read, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our author tonight, as I know you all are. You didn't come to hear me. So that's just the introduction and the framing, and we'll look forward to a wonderful conversation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. So let me do a brief introduction for Susan Shapiro, our author, who's with us tonight. Susan has taught at the New School, Columbia University, and NYU. She also freelances for a large number of publications: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Cut, Tablet, Oprah, Wired, and the New Yorker online. She recently wrote an article for the Tablet that has been nominated for an award about the 12 steps to a perfect apology. She's authored 13 books, in addition to the forgiveness tour and her first one, Five Men Who Broke My Heart, was just optioned, I guess you would say, for a movie. So we're delighted to have her here. And I think for all of us, myself as a psychologist and all of us just in living everyday life, we talk about forgiveness in terms of turning toward the self, turning toward God. I think of it as changing perspective. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing Susan talk about her own perspective, how that changed over time, and also what she gained from the perspectives of all of the people who wrote about their own struggles with forgiveness. Susan, the floor is yours. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rabbi and Allison. Although I say that my bio is that I'm the author of many books my family hates. So you forgot the most important part. So I thought I would start with reading I'll read a short piece that actually led to the book. And that way I found if people haven't read the book, it gives enough of a recap so that they can understand it and ask me questions if they want. And I read fast. I'll try to read slow, but it usually doesn't work. My childhood rabbi once explained that on Yom Kippur, the saddest day of the year, sins we make before God are mercifully erased, but not offenses against humans. To come clean, we have to approach those we've wronged and beg forgiveness. But what if the one who hurt me refused to express any regret? This question haunted me after my falling out with the mentor who'd helped my career, marriage, and sobriety. I trusted him for a decade and a half. Then one September night, I found out he'd lied to me. I felt betrayed. I could barely eat, sleep, or work. He refused to apologize. I wanted to be benevolent and big-hearted, but as a Manhattan journalist, I was skeptical of psychobabbling promises implying any offense could be overcome with an apology. I prided myself on being self-protective and not anyone's punching bag. I pondered the line from an ancient battle poem, "Wounded I am more awake, but with no repentance. Wounded I was only more miserable." I used to pity volatile friends who wouldn't speak to their relatives or colleagues for years at a time. I didn't want to become an angry person clinging to an endless vendetta. I'd always been forgiving. I forgave the college boyfriend who'd slept with not one, but two of my roommates. I even exonerated both of the women, but only after they'd explained they were under the influence of magic mushrooms and asked for my pardon. I could grant anyone atonement if they could cough up, "I'm sorry." Yet now the person I depended on refused to acknowledge he'd injured me. I couldn't understand his cold behavior. I cut him off, but I couldn't move on. Researching the topic of apologies, $1 million forgiveness industry popped up. A British charity, a PBS documentary, a Mayo Clinic website touting the benefits of personal exoneration, deserved or undeserved. Books from all religions promoted radical forgiveness to help you get rid of the gorilla. I read the titles with frenzied hope, yet my gorilla grew. To ease my distress, I searched for enlightenment. At the Manhattan Soup Kitchen of the Holy Apostles Church, where I taught a workshop, I asked the Reverend her feelings on forgiving. She said, "Christians repent for sins during Lent the way Jews atone on Yom Kippur. We're taught to forgive, and God will forgive us if we ask." But the man who hurt me hadn't asked or repented. A Hasidic colleague said, "Jewish law requires a person to ask heartfelt forgiveness 3 times. If the injured party won't forgive, the sinner is forgiven, and the non-forgiver has to seek forgiveness for not forgiving. Yet the initial request had to be inspired by true regret." A Muslim friend said Allah was merciful, but only after repentance. I felt vindicated, especially when my lawyer cousin Danny added that pleading guilty and expressing remorse was the deciding factor in many legal verdicts. When my mentor emailed, "I'm sorry for the imaginary crime you think I committed," his aggressive tone made me want to commit a real crime. I feared I'd never get an apology to fix what was broken. I asked Fatsal, a Hindu-born psychiatrist, how someone who'd been kind and generous for 14 years could have changed. "There's something missing from this story," Vatsal said. He used the metaphor of a commuter enraged when a woman driving an SUV stopped abruptly to get something in the back seat and risked causing an accident. The other driver couldn't see the SUV driver's infant was choking. Similarly, you have no closure because there's an unknown factor you can't see that's essential to understanding what happened, Vatsal opined. In my sadness and fury, I couldn't figure out what I didn't know. 6 months later, my mentor emailed, "I'm sorry for what happened. If I had it to do over again, I would have acted differently." He asked if he could apologize in person. We met for coffee. "I'm sorry I hurt you," he reiterated. After back and forth questions, I asked, "How's your family?" "Not well." His voice cracked as he explained that a minor medical procedure his wife needed to remove a tumor had turned out to be malignant. 6 months earlier, she'd undergone extensive brain surgery. He thought he was going to lose her. Is she okay? I asked, alarmed. She's recovering, but there might be nerve damage. Right now, she's half deaf, can't drive, can't walk without a cane, work, or fly without seizures. I had no idea. I felt like crying. This was what I didn't know. I hated how agonized and haunted he looked as he admitted he'd been in denial. I tried to compartmentalize, but I wasn't functioning well or making good decisions, he confided. Why didn't you tell me before? I asked. Hard to talk about, he said. If my husband were seriously ill, I'd lose it too. My mentor had once told me unhappy people have nothing to give. They need all of their energy to function. You would get more from a happy person you barely know. It feels like I lost a whole year, he said. I want this bad blood between us finished. Just like that it was. His words halted my rage and elicited my sympathy. My appetite, concentration, and sense of humor returned. Mesmerized by the magic dust of his mea culpa, I scanned my world for other broken bonds. Even when I didn't believe I'd sinned, I offered, if I offended someone I cared about, I could still offer an authentic apology to respect their feelings and erase their pain. That realization felt transformative and powerful. So I borrowed my mentor's humble apology technique to go on a manic forgiveness binge, wanting to make amends in every relationship I'd screwed up. Over the fall, my close family friend Isabel had asked me to read and edit hundreds of pages of her project on surviving breast cancer. Drained from my own deadlines and feud with my mentor, I told her I was too busy. She cut me off, ignoring my emails. Now I could see how important it was for her to share her harrowing journey. Blessed with health, I'd selfishly made it all about my work schedule. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you when you needed me, I called her to say. Do you want to take my upcoming class without charge and show me your pages this week? Susie, I'd love to, she said, using my childhood nickname, canceling out all the bad juju. Knowing my brother had hated something I'd published about his family, I wrote him and his wife a heartfelt letter saying, I'm sorry, I regret opening my big mouth. I never meant to hurt you. He responded by putting me back on his list for Republican propaganda. I was in again and so relieved. In a circle of forgiving everyone I'd wronged, pardon me. I saw that by obsessing over my mentor's disloyalty, I'd been myopic, small-minded, and blind to how lucky I was. Then I vowed to forgive myself. So that was a short piece that I wrote that started the book. And it actually wound up taking 10 years from start to finish because I wrote the first draft, which was mostly about my own story. And a lot of people felt it was too New York, it was too myopic, it wasn't enough. And I started interviewing people and I kind of got lost in interviewing. I interviewed rabbis from all denominations and religious figures from every different religion I knew. And then I was so upset by what happened with my mentor that I was telling a lot of friends about it. And whenever I would tell the story of what happened before it was resolved, people would start telling me their stories of the apology that they felt they deserved that they never got. And some of the stories were so astounding that I started taking notes and started interviewing people. So I wound up deciding to use 13 of the stories of the wrong that was never righted, the apology that people told me, the apology that they felt that they were owed that they never got. And so after 10 years, it finally found an editor and came out. So and that was last year, although unfortunately it came out during the pandemic, but luckily I was still able to do, thanks to the Jewish Book Council, I did a lot of Zoom events. Anyway, so Allison, you said people might have questions for me? But you're still muted.
We do certainly have some questions. I didn't know if there were any of the particular stories that you would like to talk about that were the most meaningful to you.
Yeah, there were two that I think really struck very close to home. One of them was that a friend of my father's, Manny Mandel, who's a Holocaust survivor, who kind of intimidated me when I was younger. I happened to be in Washington, D.C., where he lives, doing an event for this book that I did, the Bosnia List. And I interviewed Kenan, who was a Muslim victim of ethnic cleansing during the Balkan War. And Manny happened to be from Yugoslavia. So we started talking and he became very, very interested in the subject of forgiveness. And we wound up having just fascinating conversations. And what I love the best about his story, because you feel like all the religious people and a lot of people I interviewed would sort of focus on why they had to forgive and how they forgave. And what I loved about Manny's story was when I asked him, did you ever forgive the Germans, the Nazis? And he said, no. And he said he thrived in life out of spite. And I just, for some reason, that just struck me. And then on the opposite end, when I was in Michigan, a close girlfriend of mine did a document. She was a widow young, and she did a documentary called Transforming Loss. And one of the men, also from Michigan, because Manny lived in Michigan for a while, Gary Weinstein, he had an amazing story that he talked about, which was his wife and 2 sons were killed by a drunk driver, and he decided to forgive the drunk driver. And he was, based on his humanistic Jewish views, he decided to do that. And so his story was so powerful, and it was very close to where I grew up, and my family knew about it. And when we went to launch the book at Temple Israel, which is from a rabbi friend in Michigan, I had Manny Mandel and Gary Weinstein on the Zoom, and we just did this fascinating conversation with the rabbi, Jen Kaluzny, about all the different aspects of forgiveness and all the different ways that you could be right and you could interpret what's better for you and whether you should forgive or not to forgive. And, so those stories really were important to me because I guess because they were both from Michigan, and then we launched the book that way. And I think it was the first time my mom, who's 87, the first time she was on Zoom. And she usually hates everything I write, but she was quelling. She was so excited that like Manny Mandel, who was, their brilliant friend, the Holocaust survivor, that he was in the book. All of a sudden, she was really into it, and a lot of our relatives came. So those were the 2 stories I think that stayed with me the most.
Thank you. There's a question here on the chat. It says, how can you explain to someone who historically doesn't believe and afraid to apologize that I'm sorry doesn't cut it for a betrayal?
That's a good question. One of the misconceptions that I found a lot of people had was that I'm sorry is enough or the end, when a lot of times it's just the beginning. So in my own cases, I felt on both sides where I wanted my mentor to apologize to me, but also where I was apologizing to other people. What I realized was starting a dialogue saying, I screwed up, I hurt you, I'm so sorry. That was just the beginning. And there was a lot more to go. In some cases, it took a lot of conversations. In some cases, reparation was the most important. So it took doing something specific to make up for the problem. Certainly in my own case with my mentor, I sort of capsulized what happened, but we had a lot of conversations about it. 10 years later, it still comes up in conversation. So so I try to be as honest as possible. I think the trick, if you want to forgive somebody who can't apologize, or if you want someone to forgive you, I think the trick is to start slow, be as kind as possible, start with, sometimes the question, and I've written about this, the question that you want to start with is, how are you? Or how are you holding up? What's been going on? Because one of the things I found, especially during the pandemic, is people are really, really, really suffering. And a lot of things that you might perceive as a slight wasn't meant that way at all. And a lot of things that people have they've accused me, or they felt like I've slighted them, and I didn't mean to at all. So I think starting a conversation with kindness and how are you, and talking things out is one way to go. But I would say, if you do apologize to someone, or if you want forgiveness, you can't have the misconception that just saying, oh, I'm sorry, now it's over, is going to happen. You might have to have 20 long, drawn out conversations about it. And luckily I'm in therapy and I'm intense, and I do walk and talks with my students, walk and talk office hours, where for an hour they can talk or vent or ask questions. And so I feel like you have to make room for, for a lot of conversation and a lot of confession.
Here's another one for you. What would you say to someone who was holding a grudge against you for something you said or did, but really didn't mean any harm by, after you have already sincerely apologized, but that apology is not accepted?
Well, again, I think it's a process. And I think if you really want someone to forgive you, you kind of have to throw yourself on your sword, and as the rabbi said, and my Hasidic friend, you have to ask for forgiveness 3 times at least. But there's a story in the book that I love about a woman a mom of 2 kids who she adored, a divorced mom of 2 kids, and her son basically dumped her. He was married with 2 kids, and he basically wanted nothing to do with her. And she didn't know what she did wrong. And she kept trying and kept apologizing and kept doing everything she possibly could to keep in touch for 8 years. And what I say in the book, it's so fascinating because the cliche with love story is love means never having to say you're sorry. But for Leah, her attitude was maybe love means you always have to say you're sorry. And she just kept her eye on the prize, which was she wanted to be close to him again, and she wanted to be close to her 2 grandchildren. And 8 years later, he came to her and he was getting divorced. And he confessed to her that his wife was jealous and didn't want her to have a connection and blamed her for some problems that he had concerning their divorce. And they reconciled and they're extremely close. But 8 years, she had to basically eat crow, and he would let her in a little and then he would reject her again. And it was a long process, but now they're great. And the best thing about that story, the conclusion to that story, is during the whole time, the 8 years, she would send presents and cards to the grandkids, and some of them came through, and she would try to connect as much as she could. And as an adult, after I did the interview with her, both kids are adults, and I just went to their Facebook page just to see what they look like. And both of them for wallpaper used a picture of their grandma and the 2 of them bringing them presents when they were little kids. So even though it seemed ridiculous that she should have to apologize so many times because she was so good-hearted, in a weird way, the fact that she tried so hard stayed with her grandkids, and now they're extremely close, and she is close to her son. So I just think that's a good reference point, because I think that's a little bit more realistic to how forgiveness really works than the illusion that you could just say, I'm sorry once and everything will be all better.
Here's some other questions for you. You said that the book took 10 years. How did you decide? I mean, even just the stories that are in the book that sort of made the cut, some of them are so incredibly moving. How did you decide which stories to include?
Well, interestingly, first I had a colleague who was a Pulitzer Prize winning nonfiction writer. And before I had written any of the stories, he had read Bosnia List. And he said to me, that's the kind of thing you need to get in here, because there's somebody who was 12 and who was the victim of ethnic cleansing, and he never forgave. And then he knew about Manny, my Holocaust friend. So he was the one who told me to not only include other voices, but definitely the extreme stories, because truthfully, mine is a light story. Mine is a story about, I'm privileged and white, and my shrink screwed up, and so he sort of encouraged me. He's a historian himself, so he kind of pushed me towards the Holocaust survivor and the survivor of the Muslim genocide. So that kind of put it in my head that the more dramatic stories were going to be interesting. And then, I would say I wanted diverse voices. So I didn't just want Jewish, or I didn't just want men. I wanted diverse voices. So I definitely kept that in mind when I was choosing the stories. But also, a lot of the stories blew my mind. So I wanted stories that and I've been in therapy a long time, and I've been teaching, and I felt like I've heard everything in the past. Been a writing teacher for almost 40 years. So I felt like if a story blew my mind, that's what interested me. And one of the people I interviewed was transgender. And the apology that he never got that he wanted was he felt that God owed him an apology for putting him in the wrong body. And I was like, oh my God, that just blew my mind thinking about and talking about. And another colleague who was a poet, his parents had a arranged marriage and they were Muslim, and the father took another bride, and he still felt that years after his father died, he still wanted an apology for that. And so the idea that you could still be expecting an apology and arguing with someone posthumously kind of fascinated me. And there was one other story that blew my mind, which was a former student, Charisse, who had been raped by her father. She was pushed by the clergy at her church when she was young, when she was a teenager, to forgive him. And in the course of our interviews and conversation, she went back and she took back the apology. And that was kind of like, oh my God, so posthumously you could take back an apology. So I just sort of loved the nuances, and really I was drawn to the more extreme stories, maybe because my story was on the lighter side. It was a falling out with someone I cared about, but it wasn't as extreme. So when people confessed and told me these really very in-depth, intense things that they lived through and how they coped, I felt like they were teaching me something. And so those were the stories that I wound up. So I would say probably the 13 I used were probably the most dramatic stories that I was told.
They were really wonderful stories. You've written a lot of books. How did you get started writing? What set you on a path to be a writer?
Family lore has it that at age 1, I marched around my house reciting. My aunt had given me a book, The Child's Garden of Verses, and I was marching around reciting. I had a little shadow that goes in and out with me. So I think I always was drawn to poems and writing, to my parents' chagrin, because my dad was a doctor and they wanted a doctor, a lawyer, a business person. They wanted someone normal. And I just fell in love with writing and poetry very young. And luckily they sent me to a school for artsy weirdos that encouraged my writing. And I was an English major at University of Michigan. And then I moved to NYU. I went to New York, moved to NYU. My parents are from New York, the Lower East Side. They couldn't wait to leave. So my dad says I moved back here to spite him. And hilariously, he went to NYU. He went to it so long ago, it was in the Bronx. And now 4 of his grandkids are here. So that's kind of hilarious. And I just started writing. I just loved writing. It was just my favorite thing to do. They always say, if you could do anything else, do it. And I couldn't really do anything else. I mean, I could write by day and teach by night in order to make a living. And my husband's a writer also. So we both write by day and teach by night. But it just really was, I guess it was reading and writing early on. That was just the most exciting thing for me. And it took me a long time because I moved here when I was 20 and my first book didn't come out until I was 43. So it took me a while to figure it out. I mean, I freelanced for a lot of newspapers and magazines, but it took me a long time before I was able to break out with, my first book was like a funny sort of Sex and the City type book called 5 Men Who Broke My Heart, where I went back to re-meet my top 5 heartbreaks of all time to find out what really went wrong.
You really stuck with it. I mean, you really felt attached to the written word. You stuck with it for a really long time.
I did. I mean, I was lucky that I did get published early, which gave me encouragement, maybe false encouragement, but because my first job out of NYU, I worked at the New Yorker and I sold them a piece. And then I started writing in my early 20s for the New York Times Book Review. So that was so exciting that, so the freelancing was very exciting. I had my own book column where I got free books, like every day was Hanukkah. I get all these free books in the mail. So it was exciting. I couldn't really make a living until I started teaching at night. So that helped. But yeah, so I just, I kept going. I mean, one of the things my shrink thinks that got in the way was I was smoking and drinking. And so the shrink felt that was sort of blocking me from being able to sustain a long narrative. And actually one of my second memoir was called Lighting Up: How I Stopped Smoking, Drinking, and Everything Else I Loved in Life Except Sex. So the second memoir was really about how I was clogging up my brain and had to get clean before I could get what I wanted.
You've taught at multiple institutions. Do you find that the students are very different from one to the other?
Yeah, there's definitely different. Yeah, NYU, the new school in Columbia, there's different. And I actually did a Harvard online class and I've zoomed in a lot. interestingly, since the pandemic, I've been doing my own Zoom classes with adults, and that's really fascinating because NYU, the new school in Columbia, it was mostly undergrads or graduates. And it's truthfully, it's been very, very exciting to have people of different ages and all different, all different walks of life and careers. I just had an 80-year-old gynecologist who published his first piece, which I loved on, he just sold us the Washington Post on, can you do gynecology? Can you practice gynecology with telemedicine? So older people have more fascinating stories to tell. And what's been really cool with the pandemic, I've had a lot of people out of the country too, is that on Zoom, I could get editors and agents from all over the country to Zoom in. So that's been very exciting. So I hate to admit that I thought I was a technophobe, but I hate to admit that I think I'm starting to like the online classes better. Also, the last term I had to teach in-person hybrid. So I had to go in person with the mask on and do the technology where some of the students were on Zoom and some were in person, and you needed the vaccine card and the streamer on the daily screener on your iPhones. It was so complicated that it just seems easier to just turn on my computer at home now. But interestingly, just as many people get published. So it's interesting that I do think Zoom works. I do think that you can do just as good work. So it's interesting.
I'm a psychologist, so I think Zoom has been a lifesaver for a lot of people. Can you tell the audience about the title of your class? Do I remember it correctly? Is it Instant Gratification Takes Too Long?
Yeah, so so what happens is I've taught all kinds of different writing classes, but I call my method the Instant Gratification Takes Too Long School of Writing. And usually the goal of my class is to write and publish a piece by the end of the class. And many people do. And the reason I do that is because I studied 4 years undergrad at University of Michigan, 2 years at NYU, and then I took years of classes. And after all that time, not one professor even mentioned how to write a cover letter to learn how to send out any of the work I'd spent like 4 or 5 or 7 years perfecting. And that was frustrating. And it took a lot of years for me to put together, how does one get published? How do you start writing professionally? And there's a line from a poem I like, which is how you become what's missing. So I felt like that was the thing that nobody taught me that I always wanted. So when I started my own classes at the New School in 1993, I asked them, could I invent my own method? And I told them what it was, which was I really wanted to focus on how to get published because nobody did that. And they said, we're the New School. We don't care. Do anything you want, because it's a very liberal school. So I tried it in the first class I did. It was 12 students and 8 got published and 4 got over $1,000 or more for their pieces. So I started a rule right there, which was that any of my students who published one of their assignments for $1,000 or more have to buy me dinner. Although lately when everyone's out of town, so I said they have to buy copies of my book instead, I guess. But so it just got exciting, and they did give me stipends to meet editors, to bring in editors and agents, which is so exciting. One of the things my shrink always used to say to me is hang out with people you want to be. So, so it was really to be able to have all these great editors and agents Zoom into the classes, and they're just very specific. They're just like, you want to write for my section of the New York Times. This is what I want. This is how many words. I don't want this story. I want a story like this. Give me this amount of words. This is the email where you send it. So they made it so specific that, just was exciting. And weirdly, it kind of also got more exciting during the pandemic because people from all over the country wouldn't have access to New York Times editors or LA Times editors or, editors from the Washington Post or the Boston Globe. So it just, so it became exciting.
I'm not sure whether I don't think you've already answered this question, so I'm going to ask it. Tell us about your personal connection to Judaism and whether you think that has or has not helped you on your own journey to forgiveness.
Interesting. Well, I'm from a conservative Jewish family, and I would say I was very rebellious. Luckily, my Rabbi Groner at Shara Zedek once said to me, he said, Judaism is a religion, a nationality, and a culture, and you can embrace any aspect of it and still be considered a good Jew. So I felt that really helped me because I didn't keep kosher as I got older, and I didn't really, I wasn't that traditional. but I did feel like I embraced Judaism as a culture. So I loved Jewish authors and Jewish art and Jewish music and theater. And I also loved Israel. I have many relatives in Israel, and I used to stay there a lot and visit. And I did a lot of journalism, and advocacy work. So that really helped me. And the interesting thing was that every time I tried to get away from it, I would have editors who would say to me, whenever I would write something Jewish, they would say, "This is the best thing you've ever written." So I had a New York Times book review editor. He hated everything I wrote, except when he would give me all the Holocaust books. And I'm like, I don't want to read about the Holocaust anymore. He's like, no, but this is where you're best. You're the most poetic. And by the way, the person that took my poetry, the first people that started publishing my poetry, I think it was the Jewish Frontier and Forward and Jewish Publications. And interestingly, all along, that's really been the case. And interestingly, when I was working on the forgiveness tour, I would say that the thing that probably unlocked it the most was talking to rabbis and hearing rabbis from different denominations explaining to me their attitude about forgiveness and the Holocaust survivor. And interestingly, that I had an agent who thought it was too Jewish and he didn't like it. And I wound up splitting with him. And then I wound up with a Jewish agent who just totally got the book 100% and said, put it more. And then the Jewish Book Council really came through for me, and they did beautiful reviews, and they had me do, I think I've done 40 different Zoom events and some in person. So it's interesting that I think I early on rebelled, and it wound up, as I get older, I think it wound up, Judaism has more and more meaning to me. I actually wrote a story recently for Tablet about how the Yom Kippur story my father always told us every year after I lost him. So all of a sudden, I don't know where all of it's coming from, but all these old Bubba Mices from my family and stories and connections to rabbis seem to be coming up more as I get older.
I've had conversations with the Jewish Book Council about, should books be about Jewish things, or should they be by a Jewish author but not be about Jewish things? And JBC feels very strongly that even if an author is not writing about Jewish things, that they are writing through a Jewish lens if they are Jewish. And we've had a lot of conversations about that, especially at this time of year when the committee is reading and is trying to pick books. Can we pick a book that isn't overtly about something that is Jewish? Another question from a committee member. Many of the people in the book had terrible things happen to them, such as abuse. What human characteristic do you think is most important in allowing those people to be able to forgive those who hurt them?
Yeah, that was something interesting that I analyzed a lot. And what I found, and Manny, as the Holocaust survivor, he kept saying this thing over and over, which is, my parents adored me, and it was so interesting. And he's a psychoanalyst, but so he felt that partly because of his upbringing and that he was raised in such love, that he was capable of forgiving more than your average person would be. And that turned out to be the same with Gary Weinstein, also came from a family who had adored him. So it's interesting how it seems as if people who felt love in their life early on were somehow able to overcome more obstacles. So that stayed with me. I thought that was interesting. It also seemed as if, I hate to say it, but it really came up a lot in the book. It seemed as if people who were financially stable had more choices and it was easier for them. And so what's interesting about that sometimes is how a reparation can make a difference. So just for an example, with Manny Mandel's family, the German government paid them, I think it was $1,000 a month for many years reparation. And Manny said that made a huge difference because it allowed them to start over, and it probably allowed him to be more successful. So that was interesting to me. And even the minor thing that I mentioned with my girlfriend who had, she was mad at me that I didn't read her book and edit it, and she didn't have a lot of money. And so when I offered to let her take my class for free and that I would help her publish. That was a huge thing. So I do think that that comes into play, that I think that if someone's having a harder time in life, then I think offering a reparation that could make their life easier, that's a smart thing to do. And I think that you have to acknowledge that.
Another question from a committee member. Do you find that most people do not really care if others forgive them or if they need to apologize to someone? I think the question here is sort of in the world at large.
Yeah, I actually, I was asking everyone I knew, and I guess I would say I do tend towards writers and artists and maybe more of a intellectual kind of group of people. But truthfully, I can't think of one person when I asked the question, and I asked everywhere I went. I was doing book tours and stuff. So I would say to someone, what's the one apology you are owed that you never received? There wasn't anyone who didn't have a story. Everybody came up with a time when they were hurt and they felt slighted and they were owed an apology and they didn't get it, quite often from family members, or it was either, the most common was a romantic story like a breakup or a family member. And people were very, very passionate about it. So I actually don't remember ever asking someone a story and not having any. I mean, sometimes they wouldn't shut up. Sometimes they just go on and on and on. And my husband would tell me his stories. And, so I think if people are being honest, I think almost, I don't think I met anybody who ever said, no one's ever slighted me. Nobody owes me an apology. I've gotten all the apologies I want, if you really think about it. I think there's a lot of people who don't know how to do an appropriate apology or underestimate how much they've hurt somebody, and they don't realize that there's a way that you could get forgiveness if you approach it right. Because a very common apology is, sorry if I hurt you, which isn't an apology. That's not an apology. That's actually nasty, because you're not even saying I screwed up, I hurt you, oh my God, I'm so sorry. You're saying if I hurt you.
Yes, that's a very conditional apology.
That's not a good apology. And a lot of times people think there's one element to apology, which is saying I'm sorry. But actually in the book, I talk about there's 4 elements of a good apology, which is acknowledging what you did wrong, saying you're sorry for what you did to the person, explaining how this will never happen again, and then a reparation. And, there's a lot of different ways that one could repair a connection that's gone bad, but reparation is really maybe the most important sometimes. So I do feel like people think, oh, I said I'm sorry, what's their problem? They're going to harp on it. They want to hold a grudge. But that what they don't realize is they're holding a grudge because you never really understood their feelings, and you never really copped to what you did, and you never did it in the right way, and you didn't offer any compensation. So I do think that, not necessarily monetary, but there's a lot of ways. There's a lot of ways that one can offer a reparation. I think that that could be important and moving. So I think there's a lot of people around who don't understand that they still have work to do.
On a more personal note, how did your family handle apologies and forgiveness?
Truthfully, my family was, my parents grew up poor on the Lower East Side, and my mom was an orphan. Her mom died when she was little, and they really had a very rough time. And I think my dad proposed to my mom by saying, family lore has it, he said, I just got into med school in Chicago, you coming or not? She was 19, and he was just a couple of years older, and they had 4 kids. So they were very blunt, and nobody had been in therapy, and I was very overly sensitive. So I felt bullied a bit, and I felt like there was a lot of things that they would say. I had 3 brothers, 3 very tough brothers. So there was a lot of things, there were a lot of times where I think I felt hurt, and nobody apologized, or if they did, it was a very, what the hell's wrong with you? I'm sorry, get over it, kind of attitude. So, again, you become what's missing. So interestingly, I became a writer, and I've been in therapy a long time, and I had very, I had a female shrink who was very, very helpful and understanding, and I have a husband who's amazing, and he's a writer also, and he was in therapy. We did therapy together. So I would say I'm much more sensitive than my family in a lot of ways. And I think I'm still, I think, the only one that's ever been in therapy.
Okay.
That's a big difference.
Yes,
I mean,
that is.
on the other hand, I'll say it made me tough, because you can't be a freelance writer in New York City and make it 40 years and be successful, without being tough. So in a weird way, there were great things about my family, but I got hurt a lot emotionally. I was, and my dad hated my writing, so he hurt my feelings a lot too. He would just say, why are you running naked through the streets? Whenever I would, I'd publish a book for Random House, and I'd be so excited I'd be on the Today Show, and everybody would be so excited, and he would say, why are you running naked through the streets again? So it was like, we finally sort of reconciled everything before I lost him. But, that was complicated.
That's a great comment. Why are you running naked through the streets? He couldn't even tell you exactly what was bothering him. He could say, why are you running naked through the streets?
Yeah. And what I came to understand was that he was a private person. And also my perception of my childhood hurt him, or hurt my parents, because they had worked so hard and they thought they were giving us everything. And the fact that they paid for college and graduate school, and that we grew up without wanting everything. So to them, we had the most amazing childhood in the world, compared to what they had gone through. And to me, I was just very, very overly sensitive. So, as much as I appreciated how much they gave me, my feelings would constantly get hurt, and I wanted to be understood on a different level. I mean, I'm very, very, very close to my mom, and now hilariously, like, she won't like the book, but she'll come to the Zoom, and actually my therapist at one point had a great line. He told me that my family was not my audience. And he told me to tell my parents, I wrote it down. He said, tell them they can be proud of the accomplishment of you publishing a book without liking the book. So at a certain point, my dad would say, I'm proud of your accomplishment. And I would take it.
Susan, do you think there are any acts, any behaviors that don't deserve forgiveness?
I actually do. And that was part of what was fascinating about the book, is I didn't want to write sort of a, like a woo-woo, let's forgive everybody and be happy kind of book. I wanted to tell the truth. I mean, the story with Charisse was, that was a heavy story. And her dad, she forgave him, and then he tried to rape her again. And she doesn't want to forgive him. And it benefits her to not forgive him, because it makes her more protective over her daughter. And it's her truth. Auden, the poet Auden, says, believe your pain. And she needs to do that to move on. And interestingly, she did forgive her mother. At one point, she was really pissed off that her mother didn't protect her and stayed with the father and didn't divorce him. And it took her a lot of years to get to forgive her mom. And what was interesting is the way they eventually worked it out in Forgiveness Tour is that Charisse was not good with grammar and spelling and punctuation, even though she was a great writer, and her mother was a teacher who was very good. So when Charisse started writing about the abuse and what happened to her, she would show it to her mother, and she would say, you have to correct it for me. And so it was very, very painful for the mother to read what Charisse went through, but she would correct it, and then it would get published. And the mother used to say, this is so hard for me. And Charisse would say, I need you to understand, and I need your help to publish it. And the mother did it. And by the way, talk about a reparation. That was a great reparation, because that was a way for her to help her daughter move on and heal. And she's writing a memoir about it now. But so that was a fantastic reparation, because I felt like, they both had to come so far to reconcile, and they're very, very close now.
What do you advise people? Well, I was going to ask you, what do you advise people who can't apologize? But instead of asking you that question, let me ask you to talk about your article in the tablet. Right, because I think that does answer that question to some extent.
Right. So one of the most common things that people ask me after the book came out is, okay, the person, my mentor, apologized to me. And I had come to the conclusion I was going to forgive him myself, but I was going to forgive him and maybe never have contact with him again. And you could forgive someone and not have them in your life. So I was about to do that when he came to me and apologized. And a lot of people who read the book said to me, but what if he wouldn't have apologized? Would you ever have seen him again? How would you talk about him? Wouldn't you be enraged? So I thought, now that's a great question. So I wrote in the 12 steps of forgiveness for Yom Kippur, I wrote a piece for Tablet, which was based on my forgiveness story and everything that happened. How do you forgive someone that can't apologize? So I do think there are ways that you can forgive someone who could never say the word. So just for an example, as I mentioned, Dr. Thakur, the Hindu psychiatrist, what are the missing pieces of this story? So I think that was really helpful, and that's come up a bunch of times for me where I feel like someone can't apologize, and then when I get a bigger overview or I ask a lot of good questions, I find out why. I find out what's really going on there. So that I thought that was an important one. I think getting another opinion and talking it out is really important. So again, I love therapy, but also we have a rabbi in Michigan. We love Joseph Krakoff, and he's been extremely helpful. And he does hospice work. He actually, at the end of someone's life for hospice, he actually has them say a prayer, which is, you are forgiven, I forgive you, please forgive me. And how cathartic it is sometimes for family members to say that to each other. And so sometimes a clergy can help, a therapist or a clergy could help facilitate. Sometimes even as a mentor to my students, sometimes even pinpointing what's the apology that I was owed, why does this still bother me, what's going on with the other person, even being able to talk it out or journal and write it out sometimes could help you get, it could be illuminating. Sometimes, here's one that I love, which is if it's somebody you care about, if it's an old friend or a family member, write a checklist of everything they did wrong in your life and everything they did right. And sometimes it's interesting when, like, for example, with my mentor, as angry as I was at him, it really was so unbalanced for how many good things he did that I was able to start forgiving him just based on his past. And if someone's been really kind to you in the past, sometimes if you focus on that a little bit more than the slight, that helps. I really like also Allison Sinji had a story where her mother-in-law she thought was really nasty and made a sarcastic comment about her biracial daughter, that she looked too Chinese. But Allison was able to let her actions speak louder than those words. So the fact that she was a very, very good grandmother who doted on her daughter, Allison decided to just focus on that. So, there's a way to do that. Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of ways that one could forgive someone or even be forgiven without necessarily being able to go there and rehash and say the words. I also like, I mentioned multimedia mea culpas, because what's interesting is sometimes, like at one point when my brother was mad at me, I think I emailed him and I didn't get any response, and I texted and I didn't get any response. Well, sometimes if that happens, maybe you need to see the person in person, or maybe you need to handwrite a letter, or maybe you need to speak on the phone. So I think sometimes, especially during the pandemic, you don't realize that even though it's your preferred comfort, the method of communication that you're most comfortable with, I think sometimes you have to go to the comfort level of other people, and that makes a big difference.
Thank you. I am out of questions from the committee. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question of the author? You can put something in the chat or you can raise your hand. Anybody out there? You're all forgiven out.
How do you do this?
We can hear you speaking. So whatever you're doing it right.
Yeah, you can ask me a question.
I have one question. I would like to know, how does your mentor, the one that you wrote the book about, how does he feel about your book?
This is really a funny, that's a great question. It's a really funny answer, which is, He knows all about it. I sent him reviews. He'll write back, wow, what a great review. You're on fire. This is amazing. He has never said to, I have never said to him, did you read the book? And he has never said to me, I read the book.
Oh, that's
Is that
funny.
hilarious? Yeah, so I've sent him reviews, which in the review, it will say she's really angry at her mentor who lied to her. And so the reviews or the articles that I've written talk around it, but he has never brought it up. So, so I never, I haven't asked him. We're still in touch. There was one wonderful thing that happened after the book, because I remember the whole fight happened 10 years ago. So what happened after he did say he was sorry and told me what was happening with his family, I didn't know what to do with him because I didn't feel like I wanted to start paying him again to be my therapist, because I felt like he was going through too much and, you know, it was sort of a lot of water under the bridge, but I wasn't really ready to end the relationship because it had been 15 years and I still sort of felt like I needed him in my life. So what had happened was at one point he had said to me, after he helped me publish some books, he said to me, he was jealous because he always wanted to publish his own book about 30 years of being an addiction specialist and he didn't know how. And we'd started it a long time ago. So as we were having coffee in the restaurant, I said to him, because I didn't want to leave, but I didn't want to make an appointment and say, okay, I'm going back in your office and I'm going to pay you $200 to be my shrink again. So I threw it out really quickly and I said, why don't we finish the book? Why don't we finish your book on addiction? And he lit up and he was
Oh.
like, do you want to? So we finished the book, which was really cool because then I would go back to his office, but I wasn't paying him. I was interviewing him and we did the book together and it's called Unhooked: How to Quit Anything. And we found a publisher and it became a New York Times bestseller. So it was
Wow.
really, and we did some events together. So it was really, really cool. Was it underscored the beauty of forgiveness. I was so glad I forgave him because selfishly I got what I wanted. And also I was able to take all that wisdom and the interesting things that he taught me and make it into something that I think did good in the world. So interestingly, we're still in touch and he's never said he read it. I don't know. I don't think I'm going to ask him because I feel like I don't want to press my luck. Like I got him to, he apologized. I had reparation. I got unhooked out of it. I became a New York Times bestseller. We're still in touch. So I don't want to push my luck, I think. But
Well,
that's
I
a good
love,
Good
I like-
plan.
loved it.
Thank you.
Excellent. There is another question in the chat, and then I have one more for you after that.
Okay, good.
From Miriam Manella. Do men and women apologize differently?
That's a great question too. In general, I know it's a cliche, but I do think that women tend to be more emotional and more specific and more sensitive. So yes, I think that maybe the women that I know are more, they're kind of, they're more emotional and also they need more. So maybe a man would hear, I'm sorry, and okay, they're sorry, move on. Whereas I think a woman would, you're sorry, why are you sorry? What did you do? Are you going to do it again? Can you talk to me about it? Did you know how hurt I was? You know, so I did feel like, based on who I interviewed, I felt like women needed to have the emotional conversation maybe a little bit more than some of the men did.
I don't know if everyone online has read the book, but I got such a kick out of, I guess, the moment when you found out that your therapist hadn't really written the apology. Would you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, well, it was really
Sort of
interesting.
the Cyrano moment.
Yeah, well, what happened was, which was hilarious, was that my husband had gone through a lot of this with me because he knew just how upset I was when this whole thing happened, and he kind of protected me. And he's not usually involved with my writing. He doesn't really ask me a lot of questions, but he was asking me a lot of questions about the book when I sold it. And he asked if he could read it, which he usually doesn't do beforehand. So I said, sure. And I could tell something was up. And I said to him, you know, what's going on? He said, there's something I think I have to tell you 10 years later. And I was like, what? And he seemed so afraid to tell me something, and here it's a book about forgiveness and being hurt. So I got really nervous and I thought, oh, does he have, did he do something terrible? Like I was really, what's he going to tell me here? Was he going to tell me not to publish the book because he was a character in it? So he got me really nervous. So then what he told me was that it was actually kind of fascinating. Okay, so during the time that I was fighting with the shrink always used to say to me, my addiction specialist, his line in life was lead the least secretive life you can. I used to say, how do I stay sober and how do I stay successful? And you say, lead the least secretive life you can. So that was always my mantra. So while I was mad at him for 6 months, I was so enraged at him. Whenever anyone would ask what's up, because they knew he'd been my mentor for a long time, I would tell him. I was just like, he screwed up. I'm so mad at him. And I would just like talk about it. And we knew people in common and I just was really honest about it. So apparently the therapist heard from a lot of people that Susan Shapiro is not very happy with you. And at a certain point, he tried to contact me, but until he said, I'm sorry, I was, he said that stupid line, I'm sorry for the imaginary crime you think I committed. I cut him off. So he would email me or call me and I would just completely, I'm not dealing with you. This is not good for me. It's not good for my head. Forget it. So apparently he knew my husband and at a certain point in his own craziness, trying to figure out what was going on, he contacted my husband and said, would you call her off? Like she's telling all these people all these bad things about me. And my husband said, well, so apologize to her. And unbeknownst to me, the therapist didn't know how. He basically just wanted to call me off. Like he wanted me to be quiet and stop saying bad things about him because it was hurting his reputation. But so he wound up, my husband's a writer. So he wound up asking my husband for help. So it turned out the beautiful apology email that he sent me, which was, I'm so sorry. I screwed up. Can I meet with you to apologize in person? So it turns out he didn't write that. My husband wrote it, which by the time 10 years later, by the time I finished the book and sold the book and I hadn't seen him as a therapist for a long time, it seemed absolutely hilarious to me, like laugh out loud on the floor, funny. And what I liked the best about the whole story was that I kind of felt like the shrink had taught me how to recover from him, because by leading the least secretive life, which was opening my mouth and telling whoever asked what really happened, that's actually what wound up making him freak out and reach out to my husband and apologize. And by the way, when he apologized, I said to him, are you just trying to shut me up? And he's like, yeah, shut up already. And I said, is that the only reason? He said, no, things coexist, but stop. But so in a way, what I liked about it was that he did give me good advice, which is lead the least secretive life you can, So anyway, so the whole thing just, I felt like there's 10 endings to the book. And this, one thing bothered me was I waited 10 years to finish the book because part of it was I wanted to write a book that had wisdom and that would help people and that had a happy ending. I didn't want to write a book where I was still miserable or still, and I was so proud that I waited so long because I'm, so impatient. And the one thing that annoyed me is one of the first people that reviewed the book said they loved the book, but they hated the ending, that there shouldn't have been such a happy ending because it's not realistic. And I thought, I waited 10 years to have a happy ending, But,
And you can't make all the people happy all of the time.
Right. So I just was like, tough,
Susan, thank you so much.
Thank you. And by the way, if anybody wants to email me now that I quit all my other addictions, I'm addicted to email. So my email is profsue123@gmail.com. I think I can, let's see if I can put it in the chat. So if anybody has any more questions or wants to ask me any questions about publishing. By the way, if anyone wants to write or is interested in publishing, there it is. I have a bunch of cool events coming up. I have a great event in person and then one on July 5th. A big panel with editors and agents that's going to be online. So if anybody wants to email me any questions about writing or book events or anything, or just about forgiveness, you can email me. I promise I always answer everybody who emails me. I always answer back.
Well, we're glad you're still addicted to email.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure having you with us to close out.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
Feel free
you.
to email me if you have any questions or any comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thanks to all of you who've supported Meet the